From the titles, some of you might have come here because of that text message that you sent after midnight last night. And you're like, can that be undone? You know? And I'm afraid I'm here to tell you that no, it cannot. Like many things, it's an irreversible act. It's happened to me too, condolences. And I want to take you through another experience like that. It's something that cannot be undone. It's an irreversible experience. So I'm about to give you an example of an irreversible experience. When I was an undergraduate, I had trouble paying the rent, like people do. And I once had a nice landlord that let me pay the rent with a painting. So I gave the landlord this painting, and then I was back visiting many years later and asked, they said, you know, I just love the flowers. And I said, but did you see I also painted a face? And they were like, no, I don't see. And then in some moment I pointed it out to them. And when I did that, it was an irreversible act. You can never not see it after this. So you see a face. And now when a person looks at that painting after this experience, they usually find they first see the face and then later there's sort of flowers. So very sorry for the lack of consensual agreement before I did this to you, but this is now an irreversible experience you've had. You can't go back. So I want to talk about irreversibility and what it means. For us, it's going to be simple. You already know the first lesson of this talk. Irreversibility means that something was done that cannot be undone. So first lesson, that's what irreversibility means. There's going to be a quiz at the end, so keep track of these lessons. There's going to be 3. The other 2 I'll take you through in more detail. There's many arrows, and by arrow I'll mean many kinds of irreversibility. And I'll tell you something about decision-making, why irreversibility matters to you in some ways. Irreversibility matters when you're making decisions. You should be a little more cautious when irreversible acts are in play. So I'll take you through some of this. So first, there's many arrows, and by that I mean there's many kinds of irreversibility. And I also mean that it sometimes happens that these arrows are linked. The sense in which something is irreversible can be linked to another sense in which something's irreversible, and I'll point out one example of that in a minute. But let me just try to illustrate for you how rich and extraordinarily diverse the different kinds of irreversibility are. So one way to get a fix on irreversibility is when you see something happen and you're like, that doesn't happen that way. Someone must have reversed the video. You know, if I show you an animation of a butterfly that turns into a chrysalis, that turns into a caterpillar, you think, I know this has been reversed. Something wrong with that. So your brain is very tuned to picking up on the fact that this process goes in one direction and not the other. You don't undo the butterfly's metamorphosis. Once it's done, it cannot be undone. So let me put an irreversible process in the right direction. Here's an irreversible chemical reaction. Ethylene in bananas causes this enzymic reaction that gives rise to browning over time. And it doesn't unbrown. You've got to make the bread after it's happened. You can't go back. There are irreversible codes. So some of you might know, and if you don't, this is a good summer project. There is a $40 million treasure hidden in Arizona, supposedly, or New Mexico, somewhere on the border. According to this publication of 1885, which announced the discovery of the Beale ciphers. These ciphers were written supposedly by a man named Beale in the 1830s. He buried this treasure, and then he encrypted the location of the treasure in 3 successive codes. You got one code that led you to the second code that led you to the third code. And people made progress on these codes. The first 2 were deciphered, but the third one has not been, so it's available for you to find. And one of the problems is that it was encrypted using what's called a book cipher, which is an irreversible cipher. If you don't have the encrypting book, you cannot reliably reverse the cipher. And I'll show you just briefly why. Book ciphers work like this. You'll have a passage from a book to bed, there's knocking at the gate. And you write the alphabet above it, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. And what you do is when you want to write a phrase like hi, you go in the alphabet above and you look for H. Then you drop down to the letter below that and you write that instead. And then you carry on again. You look for I. You go to the letter below that, drop down and write that instead. So my H is above B, so I'd write B. And my I is above O, so I'd write O. So hi becomes Bo. And the problem with this cipher is that depending on which book you're using, it might happen that you get all the same letter. You know, that can happen, that for some encrypted message, the location of the treasure is, you just get D, 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 D. No amount of statistics or clever thinking can decrypt the location on the basis of D, 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 D. It doesn't tell you any information. This is an irreversible cipher. Only with the book can you go backwards. There's lots of irreversible physics. So when a cigarette burns, it doesn't unburn. And this is an example of a more general phenomenon in physics. You might know it as the great increase of disorder in the universe. How many people recently cleaned up their flat or room? Good, good. How many of you, your room is a mess, I'm afraid? Okay. Now, whose fault is that? It's not your fault. It's the universe. It's a law of nature that bedroom is going to get more and more disordered. The general increase of disorder in the universe is happening to your bedroom. You tell your friends that and your flatmates. So it's, this is something that happens very naturally, very generally, and explains a lot of things. Now, it might also, so this is an arrow. Things become disordered to the future, not to the past. Well, there's a potential link between this arrow and another one I find kind of interesting. It has to do with biology. So there's lots of arrows in biology as well, irreversible things in biology. You often have, as Darwin discovered, a situation where there's a great diversity of different characteristics of, say, birds. So they could have like lots of different beak shapes. But then through some selective pressure, like there's a drought, so there's not as much food. Only particular birds survive, like if their beaks are very big to crack the bigger nuts, or if their beaks are very narrow to reach inside of little cracks. So you started with a great diversity of bird variations, and then this is sort of, the fan loses pieces of itself. You're selecting for just a few successful birds. And there's lots of irreversible processes like this in biology. The one many of you are familiar with, you know, what's the fundamental one that we're all struggling with? It is age. You are all, I'm afraid, headed to the inevitable maw of death. And there's no stopping it, okay? There's no going back, sadly. And it's a deeply biological thing. And there's some question about whether there might be a connection between this aging process and that physical arrow that I described as disorder increasing in the universe. In a sense, you're being, as you age, that is becoming more and more disordered. Okay? And if you didn't take care of yourself, you would literally fall apart and look more like dirt than you do like an organized human. So in a sense, the slow aging and finally dying process is an example of becoming more and more disordered. So we sometimes say, why is a person different from a mountain? From this perspective, you know, a mountain decays, and that's it. There's no more to the story. It slowly falls down. But a person fights back. You keep yourself more organized. You literally input organized things, you know, like a sandwich into your body, and you make yourself more organized. And of course, you put out disorganized things when you're removing the waste, okay? A mountain doesn't do that. So this is one definition of what a living thing is. And you can see that its arrow is connected to the arrow of disorder, at least on this understanding of life. So lots of different arrows. My area of research is called the philosophy of physics. So I work in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method at the LSE. My specialty is in philosophical issues that come up in physics. And in that field, well, there's much ado about this topic. Time and its direction is a thing that physicists study. And these questions I've been asking are rather philosophical. What is the arrow? How do we define it? How do we detect it? How many arrows are there? So this is a thing that philosophers of physics ask about. I've asked about this myself a bit. My considered opinions about this are appearing in this book. And as Louise said very kindly at the beginning, it's published just this last week and is free to download. So if you Google reversing the arrow of time, you can it's open access, so you can download the PDF for free. The main idea of the book, I'll just say this part briefly before I get to the last lesson. The book is about trying to capture the irreversible flow of time. And this is yet another example of irreversibility. Sometimes I do this to myself where I get in my head and I'm very aware of the bubble of my own consciousness. This must happen to all of you regularly, or maybe just the philosophers, I'm not sure. But so you suddenly are aware that I'm surrounded by colors, the sort of lights shining here and there. You hear the sounds as vibrations in air that are vibrating your ears, and you're suddenly very aware of the sort of various stimulus that are giving rise to your conscious experience. And you can get a little lost in this moment, lose your train of thought. And that bubble is directed. That bubble is something that you feel passing and changing from one instant to the next as your conscious experience changes from one instant to the next. It gives rise to memories, so you can remember when this talk started or maybe what you had for breakfast. But you don't remember the future. This conscious experience has special directed things like that. You might have hopes about what you'll have for dinner or who you'll see tonight. But you don't really have hopes about the past in the same way. It's like that's already done. So your conscious experience is deeply directed, and this leads many people to think that it's connected to some flow of time, some deep passage that happens in reality. And then we're trying to characterize what that passage is, what it amounts to, and what it's like. And in the book, the main idea is that that passage, the deep flow of time, is connected to physics. And is connected in particular to a certain fundamental particle decay that, like many irreversible things, it can be done but cannot be undone. It only happens in one direction. It's very rare. It was discovered in 1964. It's called the neutral kaon decay into two pions. It's a bit esoteric to say that, so I won't dwell on it. But the basic thesis of the book is that something familiar, the conscious flow of time, is connected to real physical processes that were discovered in the mid-century. So this is, when people talk about the arrow of time, this is where I think it comes from. And just to highlight, this is a pretty new idea. The arrow of time, Google has this amazing resource called Ngram where you can track how often a phrase appears in books. So if you go to Ngram and you search for whatever phrase you want, some slang, some word, you can see like how often it's appearing at different times from all the books that have been scanned and cataloged by Google. So you can look for the arrow of time, or I put in a bunch of stuff, arrow of time, direction of time, temporal direction, and you don't find much mention of it at all before about the 1800s. It starts to be mentioned a little more in the 1900s, and around the time that this particle was discovered, the neutral kaon and its decay products, people suddenly started talking a lot more about this concept. And for me, it's sort of the true arrow. It's the thing that lives underneath all of the other ones. But I won't talk more about that. Now let's keep track. There were 3 lessons. What was irreversibility again? Something that can't be undone. And what's done cannot be undone. Just remember Macbeth. And there's many arrows, okay? Many arrows, and some of them might be connected, like the way the arrow of disorder might be connected to the arrow of your aging process. So now I'll just tell you something brief about how this might matter for decision making. I would sort of encourage you when you go away to just take this tool, this word that you might not have thought that much about before, irreversibility, and recognize when you see it. That thing can't be undone. And you find there's some sort of surprising thoughts you wouldn't have had otherwise if you hadn't introduced this word into your vocabulary. So this happened when I was having a chat with a colleague ethicist, Susan Barry, and it led to a paper. So this paper is called Caution About Irreversible Decisions. This is sort of the third point about that. So again, I wasn't too cautious when I showed you the painting. And you had the experience of seeing the face, but that was an irreversible act. There's lots of irreversible acts people face every day when they decide, for example, to go into surgery, when they decide in some countries to take other people's lives. There's irreversible acts like giving up on a project that you've been working on for a long time. And it's like, I'm tired of pushing this rock up the hill. I give up. And sometimes you can't take that back. So we formulate this problem as a matter of a choice between one irreversible act and one act that's not that's reversible, one act that you can take back. And for Susan, she was centrally concerned with people who are in the business of killing people. So people who have armies, people who execute people. This was one of her ethical projects while she was at the LSE. In general, what we were interested in is when you have a reversible thing in the first option and an irreversible thing in the second. But for Susan, that was usually the reversible thing would be let somebody live. The irreversible one was to kill them. So we looked at these examples, which are common for ethicists to look at. This was very foreign to me, but okay, so in ethics, people think about such things. You've got two lives. To make this more lighthearted, they're ants or something, okay? Don't worry too much about them. One is long, happy ant life. The other one is short, also a happy ant life, but the assumption about these two lives is that their total goodness is the same. So if you imagine these ants are kind of clocking how often they're happy and how often they're sad, it comes out the same. One just lives longer. And then the question is sort of making you ask, is there a reason to prefer one over the other? You know, these two lives are equally good, ant number one and ant number two. But there's an intuition that suggests, at least if it was me, the ant, I'd want the longer life, I think. But why? Not because of its goodness. The goodness is the same. Okay? And so there's different views in philosophy about this kind of thing. A utilitarian who's just calculating the total goodness thinks, well, you could choose either. Up to you. No real difference. An essentialist about the goodness of life might say you should always choose the longer. So maybe I have an intuition about that. But Susan and I, we think that there's a way that you have to weigh irreversibility when making this kind of decision, which didn't appear on first pass. So I'll just briefly tell you how to weigh irreversibility. And I'm very sorry what's about to happen. At the LSE, I'm about to show you a picture of an economist who is not from here. This is Ben Bernanke, who is former chairman of the Fed, a Princeton economist. But he has this very interesting principle, which he called the bad news principle, which if you look carefully at it, it's an example of irreversibility. So this is his paper describing it. We took this principle and we formulated it as an argument and as a theorem. We prove a mathematical result. But I'll tell you the upshot of it in totally non-mathematical terms. Our argument is that when you go into decision making where one of the options is irreversible and the other one's not, you should be more concerned about the possible cautionary news. Cautionary would mean things like, don't squish the ant. You know, that might have been the wrong decision. You might receive news later down the line which says that ant's life mattered in a way you didn't realize yet. Be cautious about smashing the ant. It's an irreversible act. Supporting news would say, OK, you can go ahead and smash the ant. It's OK. And our result is an argument that you should care more about the cautionary news and you should discount more the supporting news when irreversibility is on the line. So in this example, you know, take my ant and we've got the let live option. You know, you have an ant that gets to live a long time. Your option, of course, is to cut the life of the ant short. And we'll again say that the total goodness will be the same. If you let this ant live for a long time, you have you might get supporting news that says, OK, you should have smashed it, but you can still do that. OK, you still have the option. If you get future cautionary news, like you shouldn't smash the ant, you think, what a relief. Thank goodness I didn't smash the ant. But suppose you choose the other option. You smash the ant. Now, well, you could get supportive news that says, OK, it was the right thing to smash the ant down the line. You learn this. And you think, good, I made the right decision. Or you might get future cautionary news which says, you shouldn't have smashed that ant. You did the wrong thing. And now you've just made a mistake, and not just any mistake, an irreversible one. So the kind of news that you get regarding an irreversible act, it has a more dire consequence on the one hand. If you find that it was the wrong thing to do, later down the line, you simply can't take it back. And this has a big effect on your decision making. So our slogan is, for irreversible decision, possible new cautionary news that you might learn matters more. And there's kind of quantitative analysis that I'll skip over to do with that. There's a theorem. But let me just remind you again about the three lessons. Irreversibility is that what is done cannot be undone. There's many different kinds of arrows, and you should be a bit more cautious when your decisions involve an irreversible act. Thank you.